Hey guys, what's up, and welcome to another episode of the Goodcast Show. So today's episode is a review on a book that I read and I truly, truly love. Now, before I get the book, let me just give a bit of perspective to why I really like this book. So we live in a time now in Malaysia whereby we are seeing ever more apparent examples of racism and xenophobia and bigotry taking place, particularly from the political arena. We hear ministers, we hear MPs, we hear political commentators, social commentators regularly talk about these issues. Why they do so, I don't know. But this book sort of gave me a respite from that. It took me back to a time in Malaysian history, Southeast Asian history even, whereby you saw a sort of different way of living, where religion sort of intermingled. You saw a more pluralist society. You saw a more accepting and tolerant society. You saw a society that, dare I say, were more advanced intellectually than we are today. The book is a 98-page book, and it's a quick read, but it's truly a read that sort of made me wish that the times, the philosophical, the intellectual understandings that are written in this book existed today. It as a person such as me, who is more prone, who leans on the side of multiculturalism, peaceful harmony, a society that's harmoniously living together, understanding one another, a society that's secure in their own religious and cultural beliefs, that we can appreciate another's and we can live in harmony despite our differences. This book and really details that. And of course, I must say this: if you are of Indian, from an Indian ethnic background, you're a Hindu or Buddhist, you would definitely feel a bit more proud reading this book, seeing just how important those influences were in the early days of Southeast Asia. So keep in mind that this discussion will take place way back in the 3rd century, 4th century. We're going back way back when. So we'll be discussing about the kingdoms that existed then, the way they operated, and the relationships that they had with one another, where despite their religious focus and religious centrism of all these various kingdoms, economic factors, trade took primary importance, and I guess that is why it contributed to the success and the size of the empires that existed within Southeast Asia. So with that, I have the book is called Linkages. It's available on Gerak Budaya as we speak. We'll be sharing the links in the description. And I'm here today to discuss this book with its author, a Malaysian, Mr. Devinder Raj. How are you, sir? And welcome to the podcast.
Good. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. Yeah. As I said, I read this book and it was such an interesting read. In fact, I for a brief moment, I thought, I'll just put aside the interview and let me just read this book to really absorb. It was such a quick and easy read, but just so eye-opening. So I just want to get your thoughts on this. When I read the book, I left reading it with, like I told you, a sense of pride that, wow, just to see the influence that Indians, as the term used is Indianization, a lot in this book, and just how our rich history in such a varied history that we have, with so many communities. What was your takeaway after doing all the research after you wrote this book?
Well, the reason why I wrote this book was because in my work in the last few years, I traveled around Southeast Asia. I've been to Bujang Valley in the 1970s and I've seen the Chandi. I've been to Bali, I've been to Borobudur, I've been to Vietnam, I worked in China, I worked in Laos, and I saw similarities in some of the Hindu monuments and temples. So I thought, why not write something about it? And this is not something which I learned in school. When I was in school, that was in the 1950s, I had British teachers and we had, on history was about the Roman Empire, the Greek Empire, Mesopotamia, very little about Malaysian history. So I was curious to find out more about Southeast Asia and Malaysian history.
Yeah. But at the start of this book, you talk about how you actually named the people whom you researched, the books that you read, the journals, and all these facts that really helped you write this book. I'm just wondering, what was your takeaway from it all after writing the whole journey?
As the title says, linkages. There was such a strong link and connection between the kingdoms of Southeast Asia and Malaysia of Malaya, or Peninsula Malaya, was the hub, was the meeting point between the East and the West. So the Indians took the sea, earlier was the land route to China and then the sea route, and the Chinese also had the land route going to Nalanda University and then the sea route. And the Malay Peninsula was the meeting point. And it was a very multicultural society then. And that's what my main take was, it very multicultural. And as you know about the Bujang Valley, which is also from the 3rd to the 14th century, it was an important trade center with traders coming from the east, west, and from many other countries.
Now, in this book, there's a line, there's a paragraph that I like. It says, from Indianization was born a series of kingdoms that in the beginning were true Indian states, Cambodia, Champa, and the small states of the Malay Peninsula. The kingdoms of Sumatra, Java, and Bali, and finally Burmese and Thai kingdoms, which received Indian culture from the Mons and the Khmers. Now, before we get into who exactly are the Mons and Khmers, how pervasive was Indian culture throughout Southeast Asia at this time?
I think it was very strong in that sense. If you look at books written by George Codice, The Indianization of Southeast Asia, Majumdar, Sastry, and they give a lot of information of all these kingdoms. And even George Codice quotes a Sanskrit person, Levy or something, his name I can't quite remember.
Sylvian Levy.
Sylvian Levy.
Yeah.
And talks about the Indian culture being spread to Asia and beyond. So there was very strong Hindu and Buddhist influence in this part of Southeast Asia, and still is, except China. And China is Buddhism, but no Hinduism, although there were priests from India who had traveled by land to China, especially in William Dalrymple's book, The Golden Road. He talks about it.
Now, but again, I mean, just in case for people who would be reading this, who were the Mons and the Khmers?
The Mon and the Khmers were people from Cambodia and that area.
Okay. Is it true that I could be wrong, but in this book I sort of get the vibe that the first settlement of Indians within Southeast Asia happened in Cambodia? Is that true?
It was one of the earliest.
Okay.
Kingdoms. You see, there's very little written records about early history of all the kingdoms, because in Southeast Asia, the early writing was on bamboo strips and things like that. Because of weather, climate change, very little survived. So it is mainly from Chinese records and some Middle Eastern records and Indian records that they have built up the history of these kingdoms.
Okay. Now, again, in this book, there's one part where it talks about the landmass of Southeast Asia. At that point, it was called Sundaland. Sundaland. What is the difference between the landmass, this landmass Sundaland, its appearance at least, as compared to what Southeast Asia looks like now?
Well, before, Sumatra, Borneo, Moluccas, all the islands were joined together as a landmass. So there was migration of early people, vegetation, animals. So that is why there's a lot of commonality between all these countries of Southeast Asia. Only when the sea rose, melting of the ice, that you have these various islands. Formerly, it was just one mini continent in that sense.
Yeah, it's interesting because when I read that part where you talk about how certain parts of Sundaland are now submerged, I feel like it's sort of like a metaphor of how the sea has separated us, both physically as well as philosophically.
It has.
It has, yeah.
And apart from the sea separating us, the British have separated many of the people in many parts of the world, including Malaysia and Indonesia, with the 1824 treaty.
Yeah, definitely. They are more powerful than the sea, it seems. Again, I mean, people, of course, you hear this at sort of dinner table conversations where people talk about, certain languages being the oldest. I've heard it many times. People say, like, Tamil is the oldest. There are people who say that they found Tamil inscriptions even in the Egyptian pyramids and all that things, right? But in this book, you talk about Tamil, the role of Tamil, or at least the presence of Tamil before the coming of the Arabic languages.
Yes.
What was the role that Tamil played in Southeast Asia in this time frame that you write in this book?
Most of the earlier writing was in the Pallava script, and that most of the people who came from India were from Southeast India.
Mm-hmm.
And they traveled, and many of the kingdoms had a lot of Tamil influence. And it was not so much northern influence or North Indians, it was more Tamil. And Sastri has written quite a lot about this influence. But Majumdar, who's from northern India, he emphasizes more of the northern and Buddhist
As he would.
region.
Yeah.
So when you look at both writings, then you find, okay, and even the earlier writing was based on the Tamil language, Tamil script, Pallava script.
Pallava script. Now, again, I want to get his name correctly. G. Codis, is it?
George Codis.
George Codis, a French scholar of Southeast Asian history and archaeology.
Yeah.
Now, he uses the term Greater India.
Yeah.
Again, when I hear the word Greater India, I just think about the Indian subcontinent as it is today. But apparently, there is a different meaning. So, what was the meaning of Greater India that he was referring to?
He was referring to the countries where there was Indian influence in Southeast Asia.
Okay.
So included Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, Sumatra, and this region.
Okay.
To him, that was Greater India.
Why was it so important for India to have its influence here in this part of the world?
In the early days, prehistory, India used to travel overland to get gold, to search for gold. And after some time, there were disruptions of travel on the land route there were conflicts. And therefore, India needed gold and spices. So they decided to take the sea route. And apart from that, because of better ships, the Indian ships were very large at that time, much better than the other ships, could take in about 600 to 700 sailors at one time. So they took the land route. And the first place of landing was the Malay Peninsula. And on the other side, the Chinese also was seeking for trade. They also met at the Malay Peninsula. So this was a meeting point.
Yeah, and also I think you do refer to Indonesia as well. Indonesia is talked a lot in this book. There's a few other locations talked about. I think Indonesia gets a lot of mentions together with Kedah. Kedah is mentioned, but we'll definitely get to that. What was Indonesia then? Swarna Bhumi, I think it's called.
Land of gold.
Land of gold, yes.
Land of gold. So there's quite a lot written about Indonesia by the Chinese. The Srivijaya Empire, the Majapahit Empire. And a lot of South Indians went to Sumatra and to Java and started the kingdoms there. It was a Tamil-based kingdoms in Java and Sumatra. Srivijaya kingdom was based in Palembang in Sumatra, and at its height, it was controlling trade in most countries in Southeast Asia. Even I think Indonesia is also talked about a lot when it comes to Hinduism, because I think they are also mentioned in the Ramayana as well. Yes.
Apparently, Indonesians also partook in the Mahabharata war that was talked about. So they're very important, I think, to the Hindu belief system and all that. Yeah.
I've been to Indonesia, and I've been to Borobudur, and if you look at some of the temples and the relics, there are a lot of similarities with the ruins in this part of Southeast Asia.
Okay. I think there's one part that you talk about how in Kedah, the stone that was used was also the same stone used in Nepal. Is that true?
Yes, that's what Dr. Nasha, recently I went for a talk given by him, and he said in the latest find of the Buddha statue at Bukit Choras, there were Sri Lankan influence.
Sri Lankan.
Sri Lankan
Okay, not
influence.
Nepali. Okay.
Because he said Gupta's, I think his son or children or whatever went to Sri Lanka, and from Sri Lanka, Buddhism spread to many parts of Southeast Asia.
Yeah, definitely. Now, another thing also was quite interesting was there's also talk about the first humans in recorded history, humans in Malaysia. Who were they?
According to Peter Bellwood and a few others, they said in the early days, the migration was from South China to Southeast Asia. Some say it was a land route, some says it was via Taiwan, Philippines, Borneo, and Sumatra and Malaysia. But generally all agree it was from South China to this part.
Okay.
And they were the Hobinian culture, and you find Hobinian culture in Peninsular Malaysia in some of the caves.
And these people's ancestry is from Vietnam?
From South China.
South China.
From South China down to this part of Asia. And if you look at the languages and things like that, they say Austronesian and Austronesian languages are the languages spoken by the people on the mainland.
Okay.
And so the language was this Mon Khmer language, has very common features. Even the Aborigines spoke the Mon Khmer language in northern Malaya.
And I think you also talk about how that language, some elements are still present today with our oral Asli.
Present in the modern language.
Yeah. But I mean, there is of course a mention, or I guess a belief system that is sort of being pervaded among Malaysians, whereby they talk about the first inhabitants of Malaysia was the Malays. In your historical study, is that true?
It's difficult to say that the first were Malays, because if you look at historical records, the Malay race today is a mixed race of many people of this part of the world.
Yeah.
The early people were from the north, coming down to the south, and there were travelers from Arabia, there were travelers from Indonesia, travelers from India, and you had a sort of a mixed race in that sense. As you know, the Malay definition is a definition based on a person who speaks the Malay language, follows the Islamic faith. So it's not a language based on your DNA and your roots.
Okay.
And it is the British who created this definition in around 1911.
It was them.
It was the British. It is mentioned in this book, the Imperial Agenda.
There we go, guys. This is Mr. Devinder has written many books. This is the Imperial Agenda, also available on Gerak Budaya as well. I got it for free, so I have a lot of reading to do when I go back. Fun reading, yes. Now, the also that a quote from this book, as the person we were just talking about, Sylvan Levy, he said, India gave her mythology to her neighbors, who went to teach it to the whole world. Mother of law and philosophy, she gave her 3 quarters to Asia, a god, a religion, a doctrine, and art. She carried her sacred language, her literature, her institutions into Indonesia to the limits of the known world, and from there spread back to Madagascar and perhaps to the coast of Africa. Now, in Southeast Asia, we see evidence of this, right? It's everywhere. In our language, in our history, our culture, even our modern day culture. But in your experience, in your study, are these what sort of elements of this history is evident today in, say, places like Africa?
I wouldn't know what evidence there is in Africa because I've not been there and I've not read much. But there's evidence in most of the countries in Southeast Asia. There's evidence in Indonesia is very strong.
Yeah, strong, yeah.
I worked in Laos for 2 years, and I saw strong evidence of Indian, Hindu, Buddhist influences in Laos, in Vietnam. I've also been to Vietnam a number of times, and there was strong influence. My Son area has a lot of Buddhist ruins, no, and in Burma, in Thailand, very strong Hindu-Buddhist influence.
Definitely, yeah, till today. Now, one thing that I did not know, sir, in this book was that, of course, like I said, most of course, the knowledge that people have is also influenced by dinner table conversations, if you will. One of that belief or myth now, after reading your book, is that it was the Indian influence that brought civilization to Malaysia. It's not said, it's not believed, I guess, in totality, but there's sort of an insinuation that, yeah, this was not that civilized until the Indian influence and all that. But in your book, that doesn't say that. It says that when Indian traders came to this part of the world, they were greeted by a civilized society. They had their own systems of belief and all that. What was their way of living at that time when the Indian traders first came?
This comment is made by Majumdar and Sastry from India, who have written quite a bit about the Indianization of this part of the world.
Yeah.
And so they say there was a civilized society, there were hunters, food gatherers, they had their chiefs, but they did not have Hinduism, Buddhism, they had animism and things like that. So that was the impression.
And also, there's a very interesting part in the book where it talks about how these Indians who came to Malaysia, sort of how they sort of integrated themselves into society, right? How they basically convinced all the chieftains that would have been existed there and all that. How did these Indians who came to Malaysia spread Hinduism, become rulers of the kingdoms established here and all that? How do they achieve this?
You see, initially the traders were the ones who came and traveled. And after some time with the traders, they brought in their priests. And because of the monsoon season, when they came here, they could not go back immediately. They have to wait 6 months and so. So over time, they stayed here. Some of them spent more time, some of them got married, and so spread their religion.
That's how it is. Occupation through love. I like it. Love and romance. Now, again, as I mentioned earlier, another location that's mentioned a lot in this book is Kedah.
Yes.
And we all know that Kedah has a lot of significance in this history. But I would like you to tell us, what was the significance of Kedah at this time?
I actually went to Kedah 10 days ago to the Bujang Valley.
Okay.
And the Bujang Valley, historical record says, is from somewhere from the 3rd to the 14th century. And it was an important trading center because the Bujang Valley at those times, there were a number of rivers and things like that, and there was a bay where the ships could go inland in that sense. Over time, it got silted, and so ships could not travel up and move to Malacca. After the 14th century, Bujang Valley went down, the Malacca Empire came up.
Okay.
And Dr. Nasha also talks about it. A very multicultural society existed in the Bujang Valley at that time. There were, because of the finds, a lot of Chinese ceramics have been found, coins from the Middle East have been found, Indian artifacts, temples, ruins have been found. It was a very multicultural society. So that's Bujang Valley.
But was Bujang Valley an empire on its own, or was it?
It wasn't an empire. It wasn't a kingdom because there was no king in the Bujang Valley.
Okay.
You don't read about any king or kingdom
exactly,
in Bujang Valley.
Yeah.
And
but you do see all the artifacts and all that, like the chandis and all that.
you see, there were local chiefs, various chiefs. Even Srivijaya Empire, you don't hear about a king. It's sort of a Mandela. There were chiefs in that area, and there were chiefs in the surrounding areas. And Srivijaya was a trading empire. So that was Bujang Valley.
That means it was like vassal states, is it?
Yes, sort of like vassal states.
Okay, okay. Now, again, I mean, as we talked about earlier, I've always had the assumption that the term Hindu-Buddhist basically means that we were Hindu first, then we went to Buddhism, and then after that we went to Islam, right? So it's just a progression of time. But this book paints a different picture. It talks about how a lot of the kingdoms that existed, the Hinduism and Buddhism sort of coexisted. I mean, to be fair, you could say that Buddhism is sort of like it's sort of like the sister religion of, right? But they sort of coexisted. How do they coexist in the kingdoms you talk about in your book?
If you look at history, Hinduism came first and Buddhism came later,
Yes.
and therefore Buddhism has elements of Hinduism.
Yes.
So the early people who came here were Hindus, and later the Gupta Empire, many Buddhists traveled. And if you look at the ruins, take Angkor Wat, you'll find it was a Vishnu temple.
Yes.
And later, there was reconstruction and a lot of Buddhist elements came in. So therefore, the Hindus and Buddhists sort of coexisted in this part of the world. And that's what it has been for a long time, especially in Indonesia, in Cambodia, and Thailand.
There's also one thing that I would just like to get because I've had friends with that name, but the name Varman appears a lot. What was that name? I mean, what did it mean?
I'm not sure what it means, but it was a Sanskrit name, and a lot of rulers had the name
All
Varman.
of them. Yeah, Varman. Yeah, at the end of their name.
Yes.
Yes. I was like, wow, what? I didn't know this name was so powerful. I have friends with that name, but yeah. Of course, we cannot talk anything. When you talk about history, of course, especially Indian history, one kingdom that comes to mind is the Chola kingdom.
Chola kingdom.
Definitely, right? And they were the longest reigning.
It is one of the longest reigning and one of the oldest kingdoms in India. And it spread at its height from South India right up to Bengal.
Okay.
And they conquered many parts of Southeast Asia. And especially there's talk about them conquering the Srivijaya Empire. The reason why the Chola Empire came here was not to conquer Srivijaya, but because of trade. Restrictions were put by the Srivijaya Empire for the Chola ships to trade. And so they decided to come here to capture or to fight against Srivijaya. And the people in Srivijaya were surprised, were caught unaware, because the Chola Empire, instead of coming from the north to Aceh and to Kedah, they came the south of Sumatra, went to Palembang, and then up to the Kedah. And they were in Kedah for only about 60 years or so. They were not interested in colonizing it. They just wanted trade. And after they left, after 60 years, Srivijaya Empire declined, and the local Malay chiefdoms came up, and that's how the Malay chiefs were able to then again become their sultans and rule this country.
So the Chola kingdom sounds like in this book, like they were not really interested, as you say, they didn't seem too much interested in colonizing places outside of Greater India. I mean, the India that we know now, right?
Yes.
And because there is a line that talks about how I think towards the end of the Chola kingdom, they just sort of took their gas. I mean, just removed their influence completely here because they had to focus on their own thing. There was internal strife and all that. Interesting. Now, the another kingdom that sort of came out from this book, which I had no idea of, and one that is talked about, I think, comparatively the longest in this book, is the Champa kingdom.
It is.
What's that kingdom?
Okay, the Champa kingdom has a very interesting and long history.
Yeah.
If you look at it today, Hinduism was first introduced into Champa. There are very few written records.
Where is Champa in today's time?
South and central and South Vietnam.
Okay.
Central and South Vietnam. And Majumdar says one of the early rulers was called Dasana, had 10 faces, and he says it was localized text of the Ramayana.
Ramayana, yeah. Ravan had written it, yeah.
So the name was king was Dasana, Das 10 Faces.
Okay.
Majumdar writes in one of his books. So it was first had Hindu influence, and after some time there was a lot of Buddhist influence. And then Champa had a very turbulent history. The Chinese from the north attacked Champa a number of times. The Vietnamese from northwest Vietnam or northwest Southeast Asia also attacked the Champa kingdom. So the Champa kingdom was having a lot of turbulent times. So Hinduism first, then Buddhism. Then in the 11th century, 10th to 11th century, the Muslim traders, because Champa was a trading kingdom along the coast. So Muslim traders used to come there from the Malay Peninsula, from Arabia, and after a few years, a lot of them became Muslims. And today, and much later, the French came in, Christianity was brought in. So you have Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, and Christianity. And the Vietnamese attacked Champa, and many of the Muslims had then had to go to Cambodia. And from Cambodia, a number of them came to Malaysia. And if you don't mind, I would like to read
Please.
about Champa. This is from Introduction of Islam to Champa. This is written by Danny Wong, who was a lecturer at University of Malaya. He said, "Poor Rome, the king of Champa, once went to Kelantan to study Islam. He later married a Kelantanese princess whose descendants include the ruling sultan. In 1651, a wounded poor Rome died after hostilities between Champa and Vietnamese immigrants. His elder brother, Po Narab, succeeded him, and poor Rome was commemorated by a temple, commemorated by a temple built in the Nam Tram province. And a little bit more here, Danny Wong writes, "Poor Rome stayed in Kelantan a few years prior to the accession to the throne." I'll just take my glasses. I find it
Sure.
difficult to see without my glasses.
No problem.
See, poor Rome stayed in Kelantan a few years prior to the accession to the throne of Champa was likely an attempt to learn broadly about Malay culture, including the powerful Malay magic and new Islamic religion. Instead of being the main concern of poor Rome, Islam was part of the wider Malay culture that he and other chums were hoping to learn about in order to rekindle their ethnic and cultural links with the Malay world, by Danny Wong. And Danny Wong further claims that the chums had been visiting Kelantan for many centuries. Several place names such as Penglan Chepa, Kampung Chepa suggest close ties. Furthermore, textiles and costumes have names associated with the chums, such as Tanjak Chepa headdress, Sutra Chepa silk, Kain Chepa cloth, Padi Chepa, Champa paddy. A mosque was supposedly built by Champ sailors, and the ancestors of the sultanates were supposedly from Champa. So as you can see, there was very strong influence and link with Champa and Kelantan.
Yeah.
And even today, there's a Champa village in Terengganu, in Kuala Berang, and there are Champs living there.
So but interesting about Champa also, towards the end, they sort of leave the kingdom, and a lot of them come to Malaya, I mean.
I read recently there are about 10,000 Champs around this part of the world.
Okay. And Champa basically in modern day is basically Vietnam. I mean, sections of Vietnam, people of Vietnam origin, basically, what we would say Vietnam is today. Now, many examples in this book talk about how, there are a few mentions about how current governments or current institutions preserve their history. Particularly countries like Vietnam and Indonesia. Malaysia has had a very different attitude towards it, right? Occasionally, we have some, some people have the propensity to erase the past, as they will. How much of history, Malayan history, has been lost because of this?
I think quite a lot of Malaysian early history has been lost. And one of the other reasons is that it is not being taught in many of the schools and in the universities. And recently, Dr. Nasha mentioned that there were originally about 50 Hindu or Buddhist temples in the Bujang Valley, but many of them have been destroyed. And I recently went to the Bujang Valley just about 10 days ago, and I spent traveling around, going to the museum, and I found it very difficult to get information from the people around Kedah about the Bujang Valley. I went to 2 hotels to look for a guide who would show me around. I couldn't find a guide from the main hotels to show me around the Bujang Valley. And not much has been written about it. And even quite a number of my friends and colleagues, when I talk to them about the Bujang Valley, they say, where is it? They are not aware of the Bujang Valley. And if you look at records, it existed from the 3rd to the 14th century. It's only after the decline of the Bujang Valley that the Malacca Empire came up, because the ships could not land in Bujang Valley anymore. So they moved to Malacca.
It's so important, yet we don't talk about it. But it also seems that all the kingdoms that you talk about, the key focus is trade, wasn't it?
It was trade, yes.
That's quite interesting, because when I look at it, because you would think that the focus would be religion, because they had these monumental temples. You know, if you go to Indonesia, you see like temples like what is that? The
Borobudur,
and Prambanan and all that. But their focus was, number one was always business.
Was trade. With trade, the religious people came with them. Just if you look at even Malaya, you take of education, when the British came in here, it was the East India Company came in. The first schools in Malaya, including Malacca High School, Penang Free School, Raffles College, were all started by missionaries. You see? The traders came first, then the missionaries followed. In most parts of the world. That's what it is.
But then it seems like today it's quite the reverse, actually. It's more religion first than anything else, yeah. Now, again, one character that comes in the book quite later on, which I did not know, was, of course, the enigmatic Kublai Khan, the grandson of the late great Genghis Khan.
Genghis Khan.
So he wanted to expand the empire all the way up to Java, right? Now, considering at this point in time in this book, there is a lot of elements of Indianization, as you call it, Hindu-Buddhist influences. Were there any of these influences in the Mughal Empire then?
The Mughal Empire, you don't get any Hindu influence, but very strong Buddhist influence.
Buddhist influence, okay.
And Kublai Khan not only went to Java, he also went to Champa. He attacked Champa because he wanted a trade route through Thailand and Burma. Even there, he was defeated.
He was defeated.
He was defeated because many of the the warriors there could not stand the weather and the climate. It was too hot, so they deserted and they went back. So he was not successful.
Okay. Wow, it's amazing that Champa is quite the kingdom. Then.
Oh, it is very interesting history. Champa has a very interesting
history.
It's
amazing because growing up, like I told you before this podcast, you grew up reading about, not reading, but we sort of in passing. I think that our history books don't really go in detail. You hear about kingdoms like Srivijaya, Majapahit and all this. I never knew about Champa, but Champa is this big kingdom.
It is. If you look at Vietnam, for a long time, Vietnam also did not bother much about the history. It's only in the last 15, 20 years that they started recognizing it because of communism. They start recognizing, and then they are now promoting. And my son is a tourist area now. A lot of people go there to see the ancient ruins. And I haven't seen Buddhist temples in Ho Chi Minh City. There are, I understand, about 4 to 5 Hindu temples in Ho Chi Minh City, and I visited one of them. It is near the Bantan market, where many Malaysians go to.
Yeah. I mean, let's just take a break from the book. I just want to get your experience writing this book. I mean, of course, you would have made comparisons between now and then while writing it. I mean, for me, just reading it, I could not help myself but do it. What are the differences that you notice about civilization then, particularly within Malaysia? Let's talk about this area, between the attitudes and the way of life then as it is now?
From what I gather is that Peninsular Malaysia was a very multicultural society. Bujang Valley was a multicultural society. Malacca was a multicultural society. If you look at this book, where 84 languages were once spoken in Malacca.
84 languages.
Now, this is what Tome Perez wrote. And Tome Perez lived in Malacca.
Wow.
And he wrote about 84 languages. And he talks about traders coming from all parts of the world.
Okay.
So it was a very multicultural society.
So guys, the book is Where 84 Languages Were Once Spoken. Also can be purchased at Gerak Budaya as well. We'll share the links in the description. Yeah, I would love to review this book with you again, sir, on our next discussion, hopefully. Very interesting title and very, yeah. So, but I mean, one thing that stands out in this book is that the mention of a state of Tambralinga. And you refer to it as a Tamil Malay state. What does that mean, sir?
It was the South Indians who came and settled in Tambralinga, many of them. And some says there were 2 waves of them. So Tambralinga came under the Srivijaya Empire. And it was a very powerful kingdom at one time. Even the rulers there went to attack Sri Lanka, Jaffna in Sri Lanka. The king there made 2 attacks, and the second attack he was killed. When after some time the Srivijaya Empire took over, and then it sort of disappeared, and the Srivijaya Empire was taken over by in Tambralinga was by the Ayutthaya Empire of Thailand.
You know, if you compare the empires that existed here, and say, for example, if you compare it to things like the Persian empires, the ancient India empires, right? You know them for different things. Like, for example, the empires in India, for example, they were known for their literature, technology, philosophy, and all that. How does that compare with the Southeast Asian kingdoms? Were these kingdoms just focused purely on trade and not on the other aspects of life, or was there a sort of cumulative focus or not?
Most of the people who came here from Chinese and Indians came for trade. That was their main interest. And the local languages spoken was, as they say, called the language in the Nusantara area was the Malay language, but the written was the sort of based on the Indian Pallava script. So they didn't have the beginnings of a language. And later, when Islam came into this region, the Jawi script or the Arabic script took prominence, and so the older scripts just died away. And so there was not much of literature and writing by the people in this region of this area.
So it was more like a trade hub because of our location in the global trading.
Yes, it was a trade hub. They came for spices and gold.
That's it. Okay. Now, what are some of the facts in this book, or some of the revelations, if you will, if I can call it that? But what things that things that you discovered in this book that basically startled you the most?
What startled me was the links that all these kingdoms had with the Malay Peninsula, because it was sort of a midpoint between China and India. And they had such strong links. That's why the title is Linkages.
Okay. Okay.
Linkages in terms of trade, people, language, inscriptions, monuments, Hinduism, Buddhism. That's the link.
And what would you hope that people who read this book, what would you want them to take away from it?
They should realize that Peninsula Malaya was a very multicultural country then. There were people from many parts of the world. Even today, it is multicultural, but it's changing. It's changing very fast. You had the Chettis who came here, the Chinese came here, the Nonya and Babas, and you have the Dutch, the Portuguese and Malacca, the British.
It's interesting, sir, because if I take your book, Linkages, and if I compare it, if I put it next to, say, modern perceptions, is that Indians came to Malaysia during the British, right? That, I mean, of course, we know, for us, I think, even until people of my age, we sort of know that Indians were here before, but not to this extent. We weren't just here. We were sort of a very integral part of the setting up of this place. But in modern sensitivities, or it's sort of it's thought that we came as laborers from India. That's what I always hear people say. I mean, why don't more people accept this truth and would rather focus on that?
Because they are not aware, they don't know about it. You see, earlier the Indians came and settled in Malacca, and in Kedah there were the Chittis. The British wanted to develop Malaya, so they recruited workers from India because there was not enough labor from within the country for their plantations and road construction, things like that. And many of the local people did not want to work for the British. They said, why should we work? We have our land, we have rivers, we have a paddy, we have sufficient to live. So they were not interested in working. So the British had no choice but to get labor from India. That's how they brought in the Indians to this part of the world.
But technically, we were already here centuries ago, millennia ago. In fact,
The Peninsula Malaya was a center point in these linkages between the East and the West.
The thing is, I just, while reading, I was thinking to myself, I said, perhaps the Islamization of Malaysia only could take place because of the attitudes of the people then. They were so open to different things, it seems. You hear stories about different kingdoms where they had, despite them being Buddhist, but they would go to the Indian universities, they would practice, they would have Brahmins there, they call them Brahmans, I think, coming there and all that. Is that true, my assumption?
If you look at in Champa, where you have the Islam influence somewhere, was very strong in the 14th century. The reason many of them became Muslims because of rich Arab traders. They were wealthy, had a lot of money, and so over time they took on the Islamic religion. Po Rome, who was a king in Cambodia, practiced both Hinduism and Buddhism. He was a very liberal person.
Have we regressed as a people? Do you feel, in terms of our intellectualism?
We have changed.
Okay.
Rather than regressed because of public opinion and nowadays the internet and things like that. They try to sensationalize small issues rather than the bigger picture. And people are hooked on the internet and Facebook, where you get everybody has an opinion on something or on something. And they have no reference and backing to what they say or statements they make.
How long did it take you to write this book, sir? Because in the start you talk about doing a lot of research for this book. Sorry, I'm asking because you just said that statement. I remember that.
About a year and a half. Actually, I only started writing after I retired after the age of 70.
You retired after the age of 70? Fantastic.
I was working until 70, and after I retired, I said I need to do something to keep myself
Busy.
occupied.
Yeah.
So I started reading about. I never did history in the university.
Okay.
History was not my favorite subject even in school.
Okay.
Only because of my travels in this part of the world and seeing these various kingdoms, I took an interest and started reading and started writing. And that is why my first book on history was because I grew up in Malacca.
Oh, you're a Malaccan. Okay.
Yes,
Okay.
I grew up in Malacca. I went to Malacca High School.
Okay. But let's focus on your other books because they are on sale as well. Let's start with this because we've talked about this, but this, I love the title, The Influences of Early History on Multicultural Malacca. What's this book about, sir?
It's about the Malay Sultanate, the Malacca Empire, and the influence of the Arab traders, the Portuguese, the Dutch, and the British coming to Malacca and becoming it very multicultural.
My goodness. Very different picture from what we have today, I would say. Yes. And how about this? The imperial agenda from the British in Malaya.
This is from the founding of Penang by Francis Light to the independence of Malaya in 1957.
And how long did you take to write this book, sir? My goodness.
Also about a year and a half or 2 years, because after I retired, the only passion was reading and writing.
Okay.
So I had time to read.
Wow, fantastic. I can't imagine the number of books that you had to read to write one of them. It must be a lot. So back to the book, Linkages. I truly loved it. I really did love it for the simple fact that it opened my mind, and it's, like I say, it took me back to a time that I hope would exist today, but this only existed before. It's so multicultural, so hybrid and all that. You, having lived the life that you have, do you feel hopeful that this history would repeat itself today?
I don't know. It's very difficult because many people do not know the early history and they're not aware of it.
All right.
Surprisingly, just recently, I was approached by a Chinese publisher to translate that book into Chinese. There's Linkages.
Are you going to do it?
Oh, I agree to it. I'm not going to do it. They are going to do it for me.
Fantastic. It should be read by way more people. And when you see the way that history is being thought of today compared to what you are talking about in this book, what are your thoughts about that?
I think the way it is being taught is that they have, not only in Malaya, most countries changed their history in that sense to suit their people. The politicians are now in charge of the countries and they decide in which direction the country goes.
Yeah.
And so that's what has happened. So there's so much more emphasis on Islam in our history books rather than of the earlier aspects of the country. They talk about Malacca as the founder of the kingdom, but they should go back to Kedah, which was so much earlier. That is where it first became a multicultural center. And there's nothing much written about the Bujang Valley and of Kedah.
No, in fact, I think, I can't remember which kingdom it was, but there's one of it where Kedah was in fact their capital. Across all the influences they had, Indonesia, it was Kedah. I can't remember which kingdom it was, but it was also, I was so surprised to find that out as well. But now, last but not least, and I love to ask this question to you because of your age and the life that you have lived. What's the difference between the Malaysia you know and what it is today?
It's very different. When I was in teacher training college and in the university, it was very mixed. There was no difference whether you're Malay, Chinese, Dutch, Portuguese, or whatever. We mixed together and have friends of all races. And I once borrowed my father's car. 5 of us drove from Malacca to Singapore. There was a Chinese friend, there was a Malay friend, and an Indian friend. We drove together 5 days. So there was no difference. Today it's very different. It's a different world altogether.
Different world. How so, sir?
So much so you do not sit together for a meal. And even in working places, there's segregation. It was not so before. Even in schools, you can see that today most of the national schools, the majority of the students are Malays. The Chinese and Indians who can afford it send them to private schools or international schools, and many Indians are also sending their children to the Tamil schools, and they are performing very well.
Very well, yeah.
So that's what has happened.
What's your hope for this country, sir?
There's still hope, provided the politicians can change their game.
Okay.
It's the politicians who are dictating terms in most of the countries.
Yeah, and unfortunately that is so. Yeah. And I'm sorry, because I think this is so intertwined with your book. Your book, like I said, it talks about linkages, and the theme of the book is definitely multiculturalism, and this. I mean, it's a very beautiful time to have to live. I would think, as a person for me who likes history, I like to talk about religion and philosophy. I think this was sort of the golden age of that time, I would say. What's your advice to Malaysians as we move forward?
I think they should include earlier history in the syllabus so that people are aware of their roots, where they came from and where they are going to, and what has transpired over the years and why the changes took place.
Definitely.
I think histories would have a good lesson for everyone so that they would be aware of their roots.
And that's interesting, but I just want to get to basically talk more about that. What's the benefits of knowing your past?
I think knowing your past or knowing your roots is very important for a person because you want to know where you came from. Just take a tree. Without the roots, it would not grow.
Wow, very perfectly said, sir. Perfectly said. So guys, I mean, the book is called Linkages. It's available on Gerak Budaya. It's a fantastic book. I read it and I vouch. I mean, it's a fantastic book. It will show you a history in Malaya, in the history of Southeast Asia that you may not be privy to based on our standard education system that we have. Now, in closing, I'd just like to say this, and perhaps maybe you can elaborate on it also. Being an Indian living in Malaysia, sometimes we tend to hear a lot of talk about just how bad things are, about how much help we need, how much support, very negative conversations about Indians. And I feel as a person, for me, who has worked with kids and youth in various foundations, I see a sense of insecurity in them. I don't have that insecurity because I read about my past and I know where my past is. And I do believe that for you to know where you're going, you have to know where you've been. And this book really tells you about our past. And it's such a amazing history that we have as a people, as a community, as a culture, and how integral we were in this part of the world, in the establishment of Southeast Asia, if you will. Of course, there are previous nations, people who lived here before that, but the influence that India had was just so phenomenal that I think it should be read by everyone. I do believe that, sir.
Apart from that, they should promote the Bujang Valley more to the Malaysians so that they go to the museum and go to the sites and see of the multicultural influences of other countries in Malaya.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, so guys, that's all we have for you today, but this is a fantastic book. I'll be sharing the links in the description. Get your copy and just have a nice Sunday read. It's really fantastic, and it will really make you appreciate our history and our culture way more. Thank you so much, sir, for being on the podcast. Thank you so much. And just a mention here, he has other books as well. The man has time, so he's writing a lot of books. The Imperial Agenda, which is also available on Gerak Budaya, which please get your copies as well. The Influences of Early History on Multicultural, Malacca. This is an interesting book. I'll definitely read this. And of course, this one. I love the title. In fact, I wanted to talk to you about this book, as I told you earlier, where 84 languages were spoken. This is a take on Malacca and just how multicultural and cosmopolitan it was way back then. Thank you so much, sir, for coming on the podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And of course, thank you to Gerak Budaya for making this happen. And to all of y'all, as I said, the links will be in the description. Get your copy and truly educate yourself on the history of our great country. Thank you. We'll see you again. Bye.